So, welcome to the first of a few sessions on what fundraising is going to look like after the lockdown. My name is Allan Freeman. I'm a consultant and work with numerous charities across fundraising strategy, individual giving, fundraising development, legacies, and I'm also chair of Remember a Charity. So this idea came out of a conversation that myself and Rob Alcroft had about there are lots of views, lots of opinions around what might happen with fundraising in the future. And we thought we'd just get a group of people together over a few sessions to chat about that, have some discussion, have some debate, perhaps have some even some argument around what might happen. So that's what we're going to do for the next half an hour or so. And I'll introduce you now to Rob.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, my name's Rob Alcroft, and I'm a fundraising consultant, having previously served as head of fundraising strategy and planning at NSPCC. I've spent a few years both as an independent consultant and running a creative agency. I now run a consultancy agency hybrid. And I'm really privileged and honoured to introduce our two first guests for this series of conversations. So I'd just like to introduce you to Stephen George, who is a fundraising and leadership coach and consultant. He focuses on helping charities to become and charity leaders to become entrepreneurial and creative leaders so that they can raise more money and do more good. He has over 30 years experience in the sector, so he's worked with charity leaders at all levels, locally, nationally and globally. He's previously served in a number of different contexts as director with NSPCC, with Action for Hearing Loss, and with Maggie's Cancer Care. And he's also served as a chair of Remember a Charity and as vice chair of the Institute of Fundraising. So welcome, Stephen. And finally, can I introduce you as well to Marcus Missen, who's a renowned fundraising leader and commentator, best known for driving sector leader work over the last 8 years as Director of Communications and Fundraising at WaterAid. Previously served as Director of NSPCC, of Every Child, and on top of this, Marcus sits as an advisory board member for the International Fundraising Congress and as a trustee for Bond UK and the International Broadcasting Trust. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you.
So I'm going to move into the first question. So first of all, I just want to open it up really to both of you. How positive are you about the future of fundraising and why? Stephen, let's go to you first.
So I think positivity is the right question in here, because there's some number of factors that would determine whether or not you can be positive, or whether or not you take a negative view. Lots of people I know are they're glass half full, half full, half empty kind of people, and I think we do need a level of positivity around it in order to be able to understand what is likely to happen and what we want to happen, and I think they're kind of different things. So I'm positive because I think fundraising has found it's kind of found its mojo again, and it's not in the complex stuff. It's actually in the simplistic, simple essence of what fundraising was really all about. And many of us, and certainly you guys here in that, have always practiced and believed that to be something that's the case. So it's found that, and the complexity and the overlaying of things appears to have actually, they don't matter. In the middle of a crisis, you have to go directly to the emotional connection and ask. We're doing that well, and for many, we're either relearning that. For many fundraisers, we are exposing that they can't do that. Organizations that get it and understand that and are strategic, but also have that essence, are, I think, finding themselves in an amazing position, because they're the kind of organizations that can move forward. And I think they're very positive. For those who don't, I think there'll be some casualties as a result of this. So I'm optimistic. I'm positive about it, and I think there are some resurgences of certain techniques and channels. We'll probably come on to that a bit more, but genuinely, I think fundraising will have found its place, and I think organisations and people will reconnect as to why fundraising is there and why it's important. And that could be a really interesting, flourishing moment for us afterwards.
Thank you. Marcus, do you share any of Stephen's optimism?
Yeah, I do actually. I think what we've got to accept right from the very start is that these are very challenging times. It's challenging for people in their personal lives. It's also, I think, challenging from a work point of view. And the sector is going through immense disruption. And I think like Steve said, there's going to be some organisations that adapt and survive. There'll be some organisations that don't. I think also a very important point Steve made about going back to purpose and raising data, I think is key, because I think certainly from my perception, for many years, the sector has been increasingly optimizing and been in a cycle of optimization, which has doubled down on technique. And I think in many ways, there's some I think as a sector as a whole, there's some organizations that kind of lost a sense of purpose and more focused on the technique, and as Steve said, the complexity and complication, and the industry of doing industry. Whereas I think what this is doing is it's driving innovation. It's driving people to think about what are the most important critical things. And if we just look at the fact that every Thursday people are out there clapping, what this crisis I think has brought home to so many people is that there are ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and that's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? But as well as that, it's brought back the connection of humanity, it's brought back empathy, it's brought back solidarity, and I think they're right at the very basis of every single cause in every single not-for-profit. And I think that I hope is a learning, and I think I'm also hoping it's a seismic change, a reset that will take the sector forward more strongly. But I think so much of it comes down to how organisations adapt, how they react, and that's not just fundraising, it's a total organisational challenge or opportunity.
You've both sort of mentioned this kind of going back to grassroots, so to speak, back to the purpose and the simplicity, with perhaps many years of optimisation resulting in this kind of ever more sophisticated technique focus. How important do you think it is for charities to hold on to that simplicity and go?
Yeah. Okay. So I think before the crisis, if we think about if we think about in the last 5 years the biggest social movements, and I don't mean anything complicated by that, but I mean things that have taken light, things that society have got behind and driven forward, they have not been through charities. If we think in terms of climate, you think in terms of human rights, you think in terms of so many different things, and I think that was a challenge to our sector, and I think that of course there are many people who do things through charities. Don't get me wrong, but if you think about the big movements that spark that pick up momentum, and they've been driven by people who have chosen not to engage with charities, and in some cases worked around charities. And I suspect there's an element in that of passionate people, if they were to contact a charity to say, look, I'm really passionate about the cause, I want to get involved, probably the first thing they'd be told to do is, I'll take out a regular gift, which is the wrong answer. And I think, if we look at, but if we accelerate to now and look at what is happening out there and how people are connecting and how people are finding the value in those connections and the value in having a sense of personal purpose and driving that personal purpose forward, I think that is something that if as organisations we recognise, and we recognise that we need to adapt so that we can do it on their terms and view them as partners in our mission, as opposed to people who give us money so that we can do what we do, I think that's something really, really powerful. And so if you look at some of the not techniques, but if you look at some of the, your specific questions, some of the things we're seeing, I think, we're seeing more connection over digital. I think we're seeing more connection of people bringing their own voices, their own attitude, their own personality, their own drive and purpose to issues and causes. And I think that's something that, we need to adapt to, we need to embrace, we need to accept. And if we do that and we view people who want to drive the same purpose as us as partners in driving that purpose, as opposed to people give us money, then I think that's a really powerful place to be.
Yeah, and I think that what Marcus is saying about purpose is and personal purpose and the reconnection with that is really, really important. I mean, I think there are a number of organisations. I was talking to someone the other day, and they were going, "Oh, I can't make digital work. I can't do it." And I said, "Well, it's not digital. It's not the problem with digital. The problem is you're telling people the wrong thing and no one cares about you. It's kind of not rocket science in that sense, but we're all very, very quick to blame the technique, and we've overcomplicated things. And I think, you know, actually it forces us in this crisis, because we have personal crisis and collective societal and global crisis at the same time, but it also forces organizations to respond to crisis. And you work out what's important and what isn't important, and you work out what you need and what you don't need. And in you know, I don't want too many wartime analogies, but they're not wrong, those wartime analogies, because in a kind of peacetime, when it settles, you won't need what you know, you will go, hang on a minute, we don't need that. Now, I think the way that we've built charitable connections has become complicated, and we've brought people in who just don't get it, and they are irrelevant actually in much of what is delivered and done. And the public kind of understand that there's an irrelevance with some people and some organizations in what they're saying, and they're distilling that and extracting that out. And organizations have to tune into where people are more directly, and they have to be able to say to them, that's relevant for you, that isn't anymore, you know, and all that. And so it brings us back to core mission. It brings us back to core purpose. Do we serve? There are only two purposes for charitable organizations. There are only two, and we've seen some lost sight of that. One is to serve your clients, your mission, your purpose, to deliver on that. That's your purpose. And there is only one other secondary purpose, and that's to raise sufficient funds to pay for it. The rest is all a kind of irrelevance, really, in that sense. And I think that's what's going to be happening for lots of people in organizations.
All that a bit, because I think there's something about, if we think about where we are now, we're still in the sort of health crisis of the issue. The next phase will be the economic crisis. Is it not equally possible that one of the outcomes, and I have to say I'm still cautiously optimistic about the future of fundraising, but I actually can see when we hit that economic crisis, that what the two of you are talking about is the opposite of what's going to happen. People are going to get even more entrenched in technique, because there'll be a short-term dash for cash.
Yeah, I think you're right, Alan, and I think that's what we need to resist.
Yeah,
we absolutely resist that, because I think in terms of, you know, if we go back a few years and we look at, you know, the terrible crisis that you know, the tragic death of Olive Kirk, and if we look at, okay, what drove it to that point? Well, it was an overzealousness around a 4-to-1 return. It was the fact that, you know, whether you're at board level or right through the organisation, everyone's going, optimize, 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 dash for cash, and make sure the cash works really, really hard. And of course, you know, that was part of the narrative to telemarketing agencies. It was, you know, work it hard, make sure you're driving an optimal return on investment. And I think, you know, that drives an attitude, it drives a behavior, and it as opposed to stepping back and thinking about, you know, Steve's saying, you know, what is the fundamental purpose, and how do we hang on to that? So I hope that, you know, when we come out of this, if there is, you know, and there will be an economic crisis and we've got to deal with it, I hope what we hang on to is that absolute sense of mission, and we resist the dust for cash, because you're right. You know, I think some organizations will, some people will, and I think it's the wrong thing to do, because also the other thing is that, you know, will it lead to a short-term spike in income, and then disenfranchisement, people getting, you know, pissed off with our sector, and then it goes back down again? I don't know, you know, we'll wait and see, but I hope there isn't a dash for cash.
Yeah, and I do wonder if that the illustration of all of that is whether or not, for me, there is an optimistic side, but I'm more concerned about the more pessimistic perspective about the quality of leadership.
Let's move on to that and let's talk about leadership. Right. So so I suppose, Marcus, you're the only person at the moment working in out of the four of us working in a charity, so you'll have a different view. But for the rest of us, you know, for all of us, what have we learnt about ourselves, either as consultants or, in your case, leading a team, Marcus, during this crisis, and you know, what does that mean moving forwards for organisations, for consultants? And what can we learn from it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, there's masses of things I've learned, and I've learned about myself. I've learned about my leadership style. I've learned about the people I work with, and I think there's something I was reflecting on the other day, which is that interestingly, the fact that I think we're all in a crisis together, and there probably is also something to do with the fact that we're all sitting in our sitting rooms, bedrooms, wherever we're sitting. There's a level of humanity that's crept into the conversations and crept into the exchanges, and I feel like there are bonds that are being made in these unusual circumstances that would not happen if we're in the office. So there's a greater understanding and a greater appreciation of each other, and that's really powerful. And I think it's a foundation that will continue when we get out of here and back into the office together. So that's one thing. I think there's Steve mentioned wartime analogies. I think there is something about there's peacetime leadership and there's wartime leadership. And I think that, for a very, very long time, our sector has been in a context where peacetime leadership is the leadership that prevails. So that's the leadership of consensual, it's a consensual leadership. It's let's get everyone's views. Let's come up with a decision that everyone agrees with. And I think, often what that basically means is there's a compromise. In this situation, I think what we're needing to do is adapt quickly. We need to be agile. We need to be decisive. We need to work without certainty. And we are drawing on insight, but as well as that, there's a lot of gut feel as to what's right, what's wrong, and that requires a different type of leadership. And that's probably more at the war end. And I think the reality is what our sector needs is leaders who can flex between the two. Yeah, leaders who know when to lead from the back, and leaders who know when they lead from the front. And it's important to lead from the front when you're going through uncertainty, because the reality is if you're standing at the bottom of a mountain and going, "Hey everyone, go up the top of the mountain and I'll watch you from behind," that's not going to motivate people. You've got to get out the front there and kind of go, "Okay, we can do it. We can get to the top of there. I know I've got the best team. I know we've got a phenomenal, machine behind us. So let's go for it, and let's go for it well." And I think that I think talks to actually having an attitude of positivity and having an attitude that yes, we will get through this. But as well as that, being very honest with your teams about the fact that it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. We're going to get knocked. We're going to get some things right. We're going to get some things wrong. That's fine, but we can get through this, and we will get through this, and we will come out the other end fitter and stronger. And I think when I look across many different sectors, it's sometimes hard to find that kind of that tonality of leadership coming through.
Thank you, that's helpful. Steve, anything to add?
Yeah. I think that I completely agree with Marcus. I think that there is what worries me about what we're seeing now is the quality of the leadership that in lots of organisations is just not good enough. It's not able to respond in a crisis, and it wasn't able to lead in a peacetime environment. To be honest with you, and I think that's a real challenge. I think we've got to work out how now. What's kind of exciting about it is because it's being shaken up, people are having to respond. And what's great about those kind of moments is you do get to shake that tree a little bit. And Marcus, if you've got a scenario where you've got teams and people respond to it, I'm having conversations with people where I'm seeing people who aren't responding to it at all. And in this moment that they're not responding, and beforehand you knew they wouldn't anyway. So what are you going to do about it when you get out of there? I'm a trustee of a great children's charity. And I've had really interesting perspective on that kind of leadership at that level, and how people who aren't fundraisers but actually are open, to understanding how it works, how the finances work. They've been brave. That kind of quality of leadership is the difference, and we have to find a way in which that can thrive. I think there are organisations who don't have it. And you said something about partnerships. You said something about, the leading of the teams and then consultants and other operators. I do think, in Canada, there's an agency in that, a gang that I work with, they're great. But in the marketplace, they often call people who are not part of charities suppliers. And I think that's absolutely the wrong sentence and phrase. It's kind of the wrong thing. We have to have a bigger, broader tent for organizations for purpose to work properly. We have to have the flexibility and the entrepreneurial approach that independence can bring, those opportunities where you construct teams for short-term projects built on bringing the talent that you have in the right place together to solve something and then to move on to something else. It isn't always these fixed, monolithic kind of gangs that you have. They're important to hold, but we do have to learn that flexibility of moving in and out and around. And so we're partners. And, I've never seen myself, whether I work directly for or outside, as ever being anything other than a fundraiser. I just have a different kind of perspective on what that role and how to play that role. And I think organizations are going to have to respond to it in that way. And that's an opportunity.
I think I spend a lot of time sitting in rooms and people talk about the way things work, the process, the system, this is how things work. And I think so much of this is about, process is important, systems are really, really important, but at the end of the day, it's about people. And it's about the mindset, and it's about the attitude. I rarely find people who get passionate about process, but I do find a lot of people get passionate about a purpose. And I think, it's this crisis is taking us back into that.
Rob, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just an observation, really, which may or may not spark response is I've spoken to a few charities who have been amazed at how quickly and effectively they've managed to get appeals out of the door during this crisis, something which may have taken them 3 to 6 months to get out of the door. Previously, they've managed to get together and out the door in 2 weeks and achieve record responses. Now, often the conversation around that is, well, but these are unusual times. And of course, that is the case. However, what you've done internally is not physically affected by that. You can choose to operate that way at any time, regardless of what's going on outside. Now, then it may be unsustainable to work at that level of intensity, but where is the point between the 6 months that it normally takes and the 2 weeks you've just demonstrated it can be done in? There must be somewhere in between those two, which is somewhere between the wartime and the peacetime, and a kind of a pandemic protocol, which you can enact at any time.
Yeah, and I think what you picked, absolutely put your finger on there, is precisely the kind of thing that we are finding floats to the surface and emerges. And that is entrepreneurial ability. The organizations that look and feel bloated, that have people who follow that in the wrong kind of way, we all get frustrated about the decision-making processes in charities, inside or out, and we overlay complicated points and, actually in the middle of a crisis, you cut through it. And what entrepreneurs do outside of it, peacetime or wartime, is entrepreneurs cut through it anyway because they have to. They're always having to. So we have to find and learn what happened when we were able to get an appeal out in 2 to 3 weeks, and what we didn't need, and why people behaved and acted differently, and make them feel comfortable that they can do that again when need be.
But do you think this is linked to Marcus's point about consensus? Because I think, one of my observations is that charities, exactly as Marcus said, charities like consensus. People get asked for opinions about lots of stuff, and actually what's happened in an emergency process is either people are excluded from that, or people have got very short windows to respond. So actually they only respond with, these are the 2 things that I think you need to revisit or look at or to amend. So some of this isn't really about entrepreneurialness. It's back to Marcus's point, which is actually I'm just going to take 10 people out of the loop.
Well, I think there is, I think in these situations there are some people who thrive and some people who don't. I think there's some people who go, oh my God, we're in a crisis, it's doom and gloom, the sky's falling in, and you start talking yourself downwards, and you start doing things that drive yourself and the organisation downwards. And there's other people who go, actually, you know what, it's pretty shit. There's a lot of crap happening. There's a lot of things outside my control, but there's opportunity. And so I think there is a mindset. Now, whether that's an entrepreneurial person or not, I think, you know, there is that. I think there's also something, though, that so I've got a fantastic mentor, and he drummed this into me quite some time ago. And there's an amazing book I read, which is called Willful Blindness, recommended to anyone. And basically, from a very young age, we're all brought up, you know, it's when we're first born, childhood, formative years, primary school, secondary school, higher education, employment, to conform. And not only that, we are taught to seek out, and it's a human nature thing, to seek out things that conform with our own views, our own beliefs. And if you look at, you know, things such as systems, processes such as balanced scorecards, they measure conformity to a set of different measures. What we don't do is we don't listen for the divergent view. And actually that word divergency is a negative connotations, hasn't it? And actually, I think that outside of this crisis, one of the things I've always done is listen for the divergent view. And it isn't hierarchical. It's not the people who report into me. It could be anyone, anywhere within the organisation who basically say, hang on a minute, there's another way of doing this, or hang on a minute, the thing you're not looking at is this, or hang on, the problem with that is this, or the opportunity is that. And I think in this sort of situation, I think it's really important to recognise who are those divergent voices and what are those divergent views, and act on them. And I think you're right, Alan. You know, we have stripped back, the number of meetings we have. We've stripped back how many people we can fit into a room for have a conversation. We've stripped back, that consensual piece. We've also listened to the divergent view, and that's the divergent voice in ourselves, but as well as that within our teams, who basically go, there's another way.
I can't remember whose quote it is, but it's the one that keeps coming back to me at the minute, which is I think it might be Keynes, but it's when the facts change, I change my opinion.
Yeah.
And that feels like where we are with lots of stuff now. Those rules that we've talked about, or the facts that we have had them, have just changed, and so we have a different opinion. And actually, the problem is the people who aren't changing their opinion.
Yeah, the other thing is the rules have changed. You're right, absolutely, and the rules have changed, but there are less of them, and it's kind of interesting. With less rules, there's more values and principles get driven, and principles seem to me to be far more powerful than a set of rules, because principles guide you internally as opposed to rules externally, and that's the damn sight. And people are adapting. This is situational leadership. They're changing it. Those who can't wouldn't have anyway. And, and I think it's going to change. And I think we've got to find a way of capturing, in real time, the learning of this experience. We can't, I can see the moment when you can already see it as everything changes. You can see how things start to revert back to what was, rather than actually embracing what we've learned and what we might need to change as a result of that.
And I think that is so important, the point you're making there, Steve. And I think for two things, I think first of all, it would be a real shame to kind of view this as a blip and unusual circumstances, and then people go back to how they were before. I think there's also something else, which is the world, the UK will emerge from this changed. Some of those changes will be obvious, some of them will be really quite fundamental and not obvious. And I think so for us as a sector to think that when we emerge from this we'll get back to normal, I think is just completely wrong. If we just think in terms of who would have thought we could all work from home and use technology to have meetings around the world and to have better communications and better connections than we had before. This is going to stay. The acceleration of that, the technology, the fact that Zoom and Teams are in a bit of an arms race as to what functionality they can bring out, faster. So consumption has changed, behaviours change. I think attitude will change, and I think we need to recognise those. We need to recognise it, and we need to adapt to it coming out of this.
That leads us really nicely onto our sort of next topic, which is around whether things will irrevocably change as a result of this, or whether some things will go back to what we used to consider normal.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thrust of the conversation around what survives, what doesn't survive, is is important not to close it down right now. I think, you know, it's really important we don't make some assumptions. There's assumptions being made, for instance, that face-to-face is dead. You know, it's not going to happen again. It's 3 months have stopped. It's not like it's, you know, humans require face-to-face. So let's calm down a little about it. But however, I think our attitude and approach to some things will have changed that make them kind of untenable in a way that I think, you know, I mean, Alan and I have had this conversation around legacies. I think this is the first shared traumatic moment that the globe's had since the Second World War. It'll be the moment when we go, where were you when? And it's changed your sense of mortality and who you are and what matters to you. And that will change our ability to have a legacy conversation in a way that we might not have done before. So that, for instance, is something that's powerful, that certainly could change. I do think, however, that the stuff that, if you look at what other organizations are doing, they're trying to get themselves into this sense of, we've been kind of following a model of, to get people to anchor themselves to where they are, but to think what that next bit is. So we've been saying, you know, crisis, contingency, you've got to respond, recovery, but transformation is a place to try to think about and be as a deliberate choice. And so in this moment, we have to deal with the here and now of the crisis. We build and I think for lots now in 3 or 4 weeks, is interesting how things have sort of settled, weirdly. Alan's right, there's an economic wave of horror coming our way we've got to respond to, but you know, there's a kind of odd normality in these weeks. We are really actively now having space for conversations about what recovery means. And therefore we're deciding, and that giving us a chance to test a bit in some of that space where things we know won't happen because we can't, doesn't mean they won't in the future, but let's try some things that we might not have tried before. Obviously there's a shift to digital, but that was inevitable. It's just accelerated it. And the other big shift is, I think, the way that fundraising teams are going to interact and operate will be totally different. You know, I think something like 50% of the United States population could work at home, but only 3% did. They've just predicted, saw a research yesterday that said by the end of next year, 35% will be working at home. You know, so it's capacity now, willingness and ability to do it have changed. So our way we operate and work together might mean that we can cut it back and we can do things faster and quicker. So some of that stuff I think is too soon to close down.
There's also a bit about what people want to do. So I sat on a webinar the other day, and just as a bit of fun within that, there was a question. There was about 150 people on the webinar, and there was a question about if you could go back to the office and work in the office, would you or wouldn't you? And it was split pretty 50-50, you know, and it wasn't, interestingly, from previous research I've seen, quite often the people who want to go back to the office are quite often the younger people, who part of the office is part of where their social life revolves around. They often don't have somewhere in their flat that they can easily work, or that one of them can easily work from the flat. But if they're sharing a flat with 2 or 3 other people, who's going to work from the flat that day? Because there isn't really space for 2 or 3 of them to do it. So often it's more complicated than just, or it might be more complicated than just, well, we've got the technology, we can do it. There might be audiences who want to. One of the people who wanted to go back to the office was because they said it was really difficult to have Zoom meetings with their kids walking in and out all the time. And they found that really quite stressful for them. So there's all sorts of dynamics that could change. There's that quote, and I can't remember how it works, but it's about technology, but it feels really relevant to this, which is something like, you know, we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate its impact in the long term. And it sort of feels like it's relevant to this.
There's also something interesting about the tech at the moment is that if you think, 3 months clearly is a very long time. If you think back to pre-Christmas, before all of this, there was a kind of movement emerging to rebel against social media and tech, and that people were yearning for connection and reconnection with real things. The irony is that reconnection with real things has been enabled because of the tech.
Yeah.
It's completely flipped it. You know, the first time a Zoom conversation with my parents. Now, you know, Alan, I know you're in a different place because you've got the techist savvy mother in the planet, and you know that, but mine aren't. And so watching and having interaction on a Zoom call with your 85-year-old parents is different, but it's really vital, and people have learned how to do that. You know, I think the other thing, just briefly, one of the other things I think might happen for those people who want to work somewhere is that before, lots of organizations and charities have focused on, for instance, having their offices or their home base. But I could see scenarios emerging now. We've been talking locally about how you could see resurgences of local economies, because you will see a high proportion of people now who work at home but don't want to sit at home all day. And so what was before shared space now might become much more deliberate kind of shared space. I could see offices where charities, say charity fundraisers who are working independently, instead of thinking down the line of the organization, could get together and work together and collaborate.
Why does it have to be charities? Why can't it be just all?
No, I think the point I'm saying is that all organizations are doing that. We're saying the whole of the village here is talking now about an economic resurgence and opportunity. You know, the cafes are talking now about, actually the reality is that, you know, I used to use a cafe all the time to not be here all the time and to go and work, but I'm still working remotely in a way. And I've been used to that for years for me. For others, it's brand new. So I think there's ways in which we can now find that getting together again, but not completely lose this as an opportunity.
I think you're right, and it's fascinating, isn't it? Because, you know, if we look in the outside world, there, you know, I think there's a greater sense of, not at a political level, not at all, but I think a kind of like at you know, common person level, there's a greater sense of that connectiveness around the world. But also, I think there's a greater sense of appreciation and connectiveness in the local community. If you look at, you know, everyone supporting the local restaurant through home deliveries. Companies that were delivering to restaurants now delivering to home, and everyone's going local. And I think coming out of this, I suspect we will keep those two things with a greater sense and appreciation of them. And I think, you know, the point you're all making about technology, I'll give you a really practical example of something that we've done and we will retain. So at work, we used to have these town halls. So I'd have a town hall meeting, the whole of my team, 140 people, trying to get them into a room, trying to book a room, trying to get it together, trying to get everything together, really complicated. And, you know, we struggled to do them quarterly. Since we've been in lockdown, every single Wednesday, I've got it at 2:00 this afternoon, I have Ask Marcus, half an hour, and it's kind of like, on this, we set up a team site, people can submit any questions to me in advance, or people can ask me any questions, and I will do my best to answer them. And if I can't answer them, then I will answer them before the next Wednesday or at the next Wednesday. You know, it's fantastic. And actually, effectively what we've done is we've level jumped. So rather than a message from me being cascaded down to my heads of departments, be cascaded down, team leaders be cascaded down, level jumping, talking straight to people. I think there's a greater sense of people having of that connectiveness, people hearing not the message, but the messenger delivering the message. And I can imagine when we get back into the workplace, we'll still continue doing this. And it doesn't matter if we're all sitting at desks next to each other, we will keep doing this because, you know, it's powerful. And I think, you know, that's due to technology. And why didn't we think of it a bit before? Because we've always had Skype. Well, I think need has driven it. And it's Steve's point, you know, I think there are new things that have been introduced. I think there's an acceleration of so much. You know, there's an acceleration of use of technology. There's an acceleration of a range of different things, including, you know, in the last 6 weeks, 5 weeks, 4 weeks, private sector has moved into the social space.
Absolutely.
There's no point them advertising holidays or advertising whatever. So what they're doing is they've gone deep into social space. They're very much reinforcing brand and their brand for good, brand for purpose. They won't switch it off. That will retain, because I think they're seeing there's a lot of power in it. They will be measuring it, and they will be getting. They will begin impact off the back of it that they will keep doing more of going forward. And I think we as a sector need to recognise that. We need to embrace that. And, you know, they are partners, and we need to be more willing to embrace that partnership and working with them, because they're in our space now. And actually, maybe they will drive greater impact than many not-for-profits.
you look forwards, what do you think should be the key areas or the key points to consider in a future vision for fundraising? And I guess there are probably three specifics within this. Are there any particular areas that you think are ripe for innovation? Are there any areas that you think are a particular opportunity? And do you think charities will change their attitude towards risk and innovation? And we've sort of touched on some of these things a bit already. But I think, to start the ball rolling, some of this stuff around a future vision fundraising, for me, it starts right at the top is what do we mean by fundraising? Because as you've said, Marcus, and I think you've alluded to, Steve, some of this stuff, fundraising isn't necessarily about either a regular gift or a cash gift or a direct debit or whatever. That's the end result of that, and we have to be a bit smarter around that. But also just being more thoughtful around our purpose. The big phrase that the government are using, and they've obviously had behavioural economists look at it, but I think build back better. I don't know if you've seen that. We need to build back better. And I think that's just as true for fundraising. But what are other views around the future vision and areas for innovation and attitudes towards risks and so on?
Can I start with risk? Because I think risk is the biggest one for us to get our head around at the moment. I mean, I have and I've long held the view, which I think has been amplified more recently in particular. It was a conversation, we had an international group who were having a conversation last night, and it manifested there about our attitude about what is fundraising, what it isn't. And I think we've got to recognize there's a distinct difference between fundraising and fundraisers. Because if you look at the Captain Tom thing, and I so wish he'd been called Major Tom, it would have been a lot easier. If you look at Captain Tom, what happened? We need to unpack this, because essentially for Captain Tom, an awful lot of people gave to that man and his connection and what he was trying to do. The empathy was there. There wasn't a charity really involved. It became as a secondary thing. There was a commercial platform that sat in the middle that made it possible, that was made possible by commercial platforms. And yet we're still seeing people who just are busy having a go at commercial platforms for taking what is a reasonable level of profit, but has nevertheless produced all of this good. So, there's that going on. People gave fairly blindly. They didn't really understand where the money's going. The money's gone to things that people still don't really connect with, but for them and now it doesn't matter. Big change. So fundraisers, Alan, you said that absolutely right. If organizations can tune in and understand what fundraising means and is, and its purpose, and everybody can understand and buy into that, we might be able to make it flourish. The risk is if we don't, there are too many people, there are two groups we're not connecting with. Group number one, this ability for fundraisers to take a fairly self-righteous view of themselves and to quite genuinely have a go at the motives of people who may have money. We impose our own prejudices on those people, and it's kind of wrong. It's not our place or position to do that. We can't vilify people who've got cash and then expect that to be okay. It's just not our job or position. And the more we do that, the more dangerous it becomes. And the second group is the public don't really understand what we do or why we do it. And yet we have this machine and profession and industry there, and it's disconnected from the very people that we're talking to. So there's a risk in that, and we've got to manage that. And I think, and then just finally, in terms of anything for me, the innovation space is just huge. The tech, bringing the tech together with the innovation space. Alan, we've done innovation spaces in workshops where, the whiteboards and everything else at work with it, and some fantastic sessions. We're just now doing them all online. We're doing them online, real-time kind of post-it notes with 20 people all over the place posting notes that you can. It's amazing to see how that kind of level of innovation works, and it's fast and quick, and it means people can innovate. And I think that's going to be a tremendous opportunity to look at it and think we don't have to do this the same way that we've done it before.
I would echo everything Steve has said. I mean, it's if I think about our sector, the attitude needs to change, because I think it's it's too much like a locked box with liberal-minded, like-minded people, higher educated, in the middle of that box, sucking money, pumping out good, believing we know what's right. And I think that leads to what Steve was talking about, the attitudes towards other people. It's wrong that there's a platform that makes a profit. Why is that wrong? And so I think our attitude needs to change. I think Captain Tom, is that an anomaly of COVID, or think back a few years ago, the Ice Bucket Challenge? No charity came up with that. There are enough of these things in the past which we can point to and go, there was that. And actually, when the Ice Bucket Challenge happened, Water, we did pretty well off the back of it, because we did something quite tactical. But the number of people phoned me up to say, hey Marcus, how do you go about that? Because we're doing an innovation burst and we're going to come up with the next Ice Bucket Challenge. And I said, how much are you spending? 100,000. How many years is your what period is the project running for? And my advice to them was, don't bother, don't do it. And so I think there's something there about Captain Tom has happened. What can we learn from that? And I think the biggest learnings for us are, we're not a locked box. We don't know what's right. We don't have all the answers. We're part of an ecosystem, and we need to recognize what our role is within that ecosystem, and what the role of other individuals, but as well as our entities is, and how and why are they better than us, and just accept that, and therefore have the attitude of working with them collaboratively. And I think that requires a bit of inward looking, because I think we are great at so many things, but we're not great at everything, and we shouldn't be great at everything. And I think that also requires us to really think about what is our value, not what was our value many years ago, what is our value now, and what will our value be going forward. What is our role, and what is our place within that ecosystem? And in the ecosystem, we have Captain Tom's, we have private sector, we have platform, we have technologists, we have a range of different entities. And I think that requires us to adapt. It requires us to embrace. It requires us to seek out those collaborations, and I think respect the difference. I'm glad there's a platform making a profit out of running a really good platform, because they're going to invest more in the technology, and they're going to make it even more effective and efficient. I'd have a problem if they're taking too much profit out of it, but if they take enough profit to have a sustainable solution that grows and multiplies and gets stronger and stronger, that's phenomenal, because at the end of the day, we can afford to do that.
Yeah, completely right.
Do you think, maybe this is a sidetracking, so in a minute, I think it would be good just to have any last words of wisdom on, your approach, or how you might approach thinking about future strategies post-lockdown. But some of this, for me, I've always felt we shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit by calling ourselves a not-for-profit sector. Because what it said, implicitly or explicitly in that, is we're not trying to make any money, whereas actually we are trying to make money, but we are trying to make money to do whatever it is that cause is trying to do. And the terminology just doesn't help. The mindset, the culture, the attitude, actually, as long as it's legal, decent, honest, appropriate, etc., that is the opposite of what we're trying to do. And I sort of wonder whether we need to try at some point and reframe what all of this is about.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I had a debate with someone a little while ago, and they kept calling me a fundraiser, and I said, no, I'm a marketer. I just happen to be working in a I don't want to say not-for-profit now. I also don't want to say charity, because I think the word charity is relevant to what we do. I'm going to say not-for-profit. I happen to work in not-for-profit. I'm doing marketing. We happen to be, one of the things we do is we drive engagement. The other thing we do is we drive revenue, and those two fit together. Won't go into that now. That's a whole other podcast on strategies. I think there's absolutely something about the framing, but I think it's not just the framing. I think there's also something about us thinking about the things such as the gearing, because if I was sitting in a commercial company and I had a 4-to-1 return, I'd probably be being encouraged to invest even more to take it down to 2-to-1, a 1.5-to-1, in order to drive volume. In our sector, it's like, 4-1? Could you make it 5-1? Could you make it 6-1?
Yeah.
It's the wrong mindset. It's the wrong gearing. It's the wrong approach. And I think there's so many different things that we need to step back from. You're right, Alan. I think it's about release ourselves to think differently, but be really clear about what is that purpose.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And I do think that as we kind of look forward, there is this opportunity to be very clear about what our role and purpose is. I think you said that absolutely right, Marcus, is that, that we require, I've always referred to it as a family. I think ecosystem is a great phrase, that there has to be an understanding of that, and we have to find a way in which we can explain our role, but not from that kind of arrogant perspective about, we have to explain the purpose and what's trying to be done and why it needs to be done. And we are secondary to it. We've got to be careful of that. There's a mismatch going on at the moment. The sector wants to professionalize itself and talks about the professionalism of fundraising. Yet the public think, what is that about? Why are you doing? Is that where my money's going? And so that's a very difficult space because we haven't dealt with that right. I long held the view that the sector failed miserably while the sun was shining, not to fix the roof, and it didn't project properly what we were about. It didn't connect. It wasn't honest, and we built up a problem for ourselves. And then when it burst the other way, it's been really difficult. So we have people who are leaders coming in at the moment who are trustees who don't understand it and are asking and demanding the wrong things. So we have to have a reset. And we have to find a way in which we can move forward with that reset. And we have to recognize that some are not going to survive this, and that may not be a bad thing.
So when we talk about some not surviving, in my mind, I could easily see a situation where we're talking about some charities not existing in this time. And I think one of the differences is when things were relatively good, another charity merging, taking over, but we use the word merger because we're nice people. They were comfortable with that, but now balance sheets probably being what they are, I suspect that there might be some really ceasing to exist because the charity who might take them over might not feel comfortable with their balance sheet and being willing to do it. So, you could see some situations where charities really do go under. And I think whilst that's obviously terrible, there is something again about bringing that to life, where we are at, what charities need to do, and probably charities being tighter with their purpose and their mission.
It's interesting because so for a long time I felt that our sector was the next or one of the next to be disrupted, and if we look at big infrastructure industries, they've been disrupted. Travel, holiday booking, banking, and and it's very much a kind of a tech has come in, lean, agile organizations who don't have the big infrastructure because the reason why those big infrastructural industries have been disrupted is because the raison d'etre is to maintain enough revenue to keep the infrastructure going. So they're not agile, they're not lean. I think what this is it's our disruptor. So it's not a tech startup that's come in. And I think those that won't survive are probably those that have the wrong gearing, those that don't have the right mix of revenue coming in, and those that have massive infrastructure. And there's there is a hole, and they either need to start repurposing the cost, re-engineering, and if they don't, they won't survive. So so it's our big disruptor. And I think you're right, Alan. I think there's some that won't survive. There would be some that merge, and when they merge, it would be a takeover, and there would be a strip back. And is that a bad thing? I think it probably is a long overdue thing. The other thing that you said earlier that really struck a thought in me, which is in terms of that reset, which is I sometimes hear fundraisers talk about people who give us money as people who enable us to do our jobs. I think one of the resets is that we are the enabler for them.
That's right. I couldn't. That is the problem with some of the fundraisers and some of the people who are in it and some of the people who are perpetrating that kind of view and perspective. And the more that gains currency, the more we're in trouble. And that worries me deeply. And I see it on lots of forums and that there's a kind of arrogance about it, as if we are the saviors, but the donors are the people who are trying to make this possible, and we're part of that journey and responsibility. I just want to go back to the merger thing. I think it's interesting. There's a real paradox there. Somebody last night from New Zealand was saying this bit about, that 21 or 22,000 charities in New Zealand, and they think that's crazy. If you think about why entrepreneurs build things, they build things from an entrepreneurial perspective because they have a personal mission and they drive it. It doesn't business-wise make sense to do it, but you can see why they set something up. Now, we have to find a balance between mergers, and I think it's okay for us to talk and use acquisition as a tool now in the sector, whereas before we were too polite. But I think we should embrace acquisition as a perfectly reasonable thing and balance out the need for locality, micro brands, smaller, more bespoke and distinct areas where they have clear purpose. They don't need to scale, but they're doing a great job. Ways in which we can collaborate and bring them together. I think there are other ways in which we could do that, but we have to think differently about how that works. And some organizations, I think, are going to have to understand that now might be the moment to acquire another charity, because economically it makes sense. It makes sense from the perspective of the proposition. More work can be done. Doesn't mean you necessarily are much bigger. It does mean that you might have the ability to do your purpose or mission better. And that's probably the criteria that we want to get into, I think.
If through that consolidation, the best of different entities come together and are able to drop the not so good, then that's a good thing, isn't it? That's evolution.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and now more than ever, to keep the focus on the purpose of it is the key thing. The purpose of what the organisation was trying to achieve, because whether a charity or any organisation survives, or whether it exists beyond this, the need that they were trying to meet will continue to exist. And whether a similar organisation takes over the vehicle that was being used to meet that need or not, they will be taking over the need. They'll be taking over serving that need one way or the other over a period of time. And it also, and I think there's also a tie-in really importantly here as well to what you mentioned earlier, Marcus, with the private sector moving into the social space and the social purpose space. And I think that's going to be more important than ever. Of how that happens, because at the moment we have this strange method of allocating different legal vehicles for different purposes. If you want to do good in the world, you're this legal vehicle. If you want to make profit for shareholders, you're this kind of vehicle, and we sort of segment according to that legal entity type. Whereas there's no reason why a limited company can't try and meet a social purpose as well as make the profit. Charities have been making profit and using that profit for social purpose for years, decades, well, for forever. So I think this all ties into that one picture around how do we best serve the need of that, and for me, the guiding light through that very complicated set of issues is stay focused on the purpose of what it is that this organisation is for. What is it?
And Rob, you're so spot on, and you're right. It's a total organisational thing. So I think, going back to a previous question, I think you asked Alan about changes. I get the sense often that there's an organisation and then there's fundraising, and fundraising is something that's attached on the side of the organisation, and I've heard it described before as a backroom support function. And I kind of go, well, how's it backroom support function when it's out there and it's the interface and it's the engagement point? And I hope what comes out of this is a greater integration within the organisations, because for fundraisers, and we've been talking about fundraising and fundraisers, but I think the reality is most of this conversation has been about total organisation. I think for the team that engages with external entities to drive support, for that to embody purpose and amplify the purpose and engage on purpose, I think there needs to be greater integration within organisations. Fundraising cannot be seen as an add-on. and attachment.
Yeah, it's back to that point about purpose. You know, for me, there were two purposes. Purpose one is to serve the organizer, is to serve your purpose, is to deliver your service, is to focus on that. And number two is to find the means by which you can make that happen and pay for that. Fundraising is a part of that. It isn't it. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the difference is when you focus on those two things and everything else falls underneath it. Whereas we've got ourselves into this sort of, you know, battle between fundraising and but actually, if there is a higher organizational purpose to bring in the means in order to be able to make that purpose delivered, then fundraising is a part of that, and everyone else is. Yeah. Everyone else is. And we have to find a way in which we anchor ourselves on that thing and try and make that work. And that's a real challenge for leadership right now. And some will do it and some get it and some have been getting it and not enough. And there are those who don't get it and don't understand it. And there are those who unless they embrace it, we will be in trouble. They will be in trouble. And if that's the consequence of that now, given this shift in the way that we're behaving, I think we're going to have to just face up to that.
Well, I think I would just close with, I suppose, a word of encouragement, I suppose, which ties in mostly to the innovation question coming out of this lockdown, is that it's a golden. We essentially have a golden opportunity. It's not even a once in a generation opportunity. It's a once in a century opportunity, whereby the most difficult part of change has been done for us. It's relatively easy to think of new ways to do things. The hard work in change is stopping the old ways, of getting the old habits to stop, and that has just been done for us almost overnight. That all our old ways of working and all our old ways of being and all our old ways of practicing our profession or our mission, if you like, that's been stopped for us. So now we've got this golden opportunity to just reintroduce the new ways that we've always thought, oh, I wonder what would happen if we did it that way instead of that way. And we've got a whole list of stuff that we can just look back and go, well, let's just not reintroduce that. Let's not reintroduce that. And let's not reintroduce that. It is such a golden opportunity with the hard work of change having been done for us.
There's disruption. Not only have organizations been disrupted, but society's been disrupted. And I think within that disruption, there's an opportunity to shift things, to move things, to change things. And I think, this is the point at which most organizations are going, the money, and they're looking at the money. And so I think this is I would say to people out there who drive engagement and support, I'd say be bold, be courageous, be positive, and focus on the opportunity and drive that change, because Rob's right. This is an opportunity that's never going to rise again, to shift the axis.
First thing I would say is the sort of final thing is particularly to fundraisers is suspend your self-righteousness and judgment of donors' motives, behaviours and aspirations. You do your organisations a massive disservice in doing so, and park it. It's not your job. You should be building a bigger, broader tent and the enabler rather than the judgment that sits in the middle of it, and that's got to happen or else. I mean, that's the number one thing, because then I think that leads for me then into the defining of our attitude to what fundraising is and about what our role and value is and how we can redefine that. That matters for me. I think there's something around final piece around the quality of leadership. That leadership should now be brave and innovative. It shouldn't be trying to sit around and do what necessarily was. And for that to work, you need to trust your people. You need to find good people. You need to lose the people who aren't be blunt, and you need to build bigger, broader, collaborative teams now. And if you can do that, I think you can move faster. And don't lose the sense of what can be achieved when crisis emerges, in the moment when it all settles down. There's some valuable lessons and experiences learned from this. And I think if we can embrace them and capture them and take them forward, we've got a very bright opportunity.
One of the techniques that I've used recently is just envisaging with some of the charities I work with that actually, if they were setting up their charity today, how would they do it? Because what it did was it took away all of the baggage that says, well, we can't do that because we've got this, and we can't do that because we've got that, and it just allowed people to think more differently, and it's led to some interesting places. Just to wrap up, thanks very much for your time. I think what's clear is that we've gone through some horrible times, both personally and professionally and societally. There is change. We don't really know how much it's going to stay, how much the change is going to change. We've probably got some not very nice times to come economically, but there is optimism for fundraising if we can get it right. And we need to be ambitious and positive about it to deliver that. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Pleasure.